26 September 1918. The pre-dawn darkness along the Meuse River hung thick with anticipation, a living thing that pressed against the chests of nearly 600,000 American soldiers crouched in their trenches. Private James Thornton of the 77th Division scraped mud from his rifle barrel with trembling fingers, listening to the unnatural silence that preceded the storm. In 4 hours, the largest American military operation in history would begin, and he would be among the first wave to break against German defenses that had stood impregnable for 4 years. General John Joseph Pershing stood in his command post 15 miles behind the lines, studying maps by lamplight, with an intensity that had become legendary among his staff. The commander of the American Expeditionary Forces had spent months resisting French and British pressure to scatter his troops as replacements in their depleted armies. Now finally, he would prove that American forces could fight as an independent army, that the doughboys could accomplish what the exhausted Europeans could not. The objective was brutally simple yet strategically vital. Break through 24 miles of German defenses between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest, cut the critical railway line at Sedan, and sever the supply arteries feeding the entire German Western Front. The German defenders knew they were coming. Crown Prince Wilhelm, commanding the forces opposite the American sector, had transformed the landscape into a masterwork of defensive engineering. 3 major trench systems, each more formidable than the last, stretched across terrain that nature itself seemed to have designed for defense. The Argonne Forest rose dark and impenetrable to the west, its ancient trees hiding machine gun nests and artillery positions. The heights of the Meuse dominated the eastern flank, offering German observers perfect visibility across the American lines. Between these natural fortresses lay a killing ground of barbed wire, concrete pillboxes, and carefully ranged artillery positions. According to detailed accounts preserved in the United States Army Center of Military History archives, the American forces assembled for this offensive represented an extraordinary cross-section of the nation. Farm boys from Iowa stood alongside factory workers from Pittsburgh. Recent immigrants who barely spoke English served beside families who had fought in every American war since the Revolution. Many had received only weeks of training before shipping overseas. The 77th Division, dubbed the Metropolitan Division, drew its ranks primarily from New York City's melting pot, men who had never seen a farm now prepared to fight through some of Europe's most difficult agricultural terrain. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton commanded a brigade of tanks, the newest and most uncertain technology on the battlefield. His French-built Renault tanks were slow, mechanically unreliable, and offered their crews virtually no protection. Yet Patton believed they represented the future of warfare. He prowled among his vehicles that final night, alternately encouraging his men and cursing the machines that would carry them into battle. At precisely 0530 hours on September 26th, the darkness erupted. Over 4,000 artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, creating a rolling barrage that could be heard in Paris, 130 miles away. The ground shook violently as millions of shells arced overhead toward German positions. The Great War's final chapter had begun. 26 September 1918, 0830 hours. The artillery ceased abruptly, leaving an eerie ringing silence across the front. Captain Edward Allworth of the 89th Division blew his whistle and climbed from his trench, immediately feeling exposed as dawn light revealed the scarred landscape ahead. Around him, thousands of soldiers emerged simultaneously, forming lines that stretched as far as the eye could see through the morning mist. They advanced at a steady walk behind a creeping barrage of artillery fire that moved forward 100 meters every 4 minutes, designed to keep German defenders pinned in their bunkers. The initial advance proceeded with surprising ease. German frontline positions, pulverized by the massive bombardment, offered little resistance. Private Thornton found himself stepping over abandoned trenches, past shattered equipment and dazed prisoners who seemed relieved to be captured. By mid-morning, American forces had penetrated 3 miles into German territory, and optimistic officers began speaking of reaching the final objective within days. General Pershing received reports at his headquarters with cautious satisfaction, knowing that breaking through the first defensive line meant little if momentum could not be sustained. But the German army had not survived 4 years of brutal warfare by being unprepared. As American forces pushed deeper, they entered the second defensive system, and the character of the battle transformed completely. Machine gun nests that had remained silent during the advance now opened fire with devastating effect. German artillery, having withdrawn to pre-registered positions, began dropping shells with terrifying accuracy into the advancing American formations. The creeping barrage that was supposed to protect the infantry moved forward on its predetermined schedule, leaving the troops behind it exposed and vulnerable. Lieutenant Patton's tanks encountered terrain that reduced them from fearsome weapons to lumbering targets. The narrow roads through the Argonne became clogged with disabled vehicles, supply wagons, and columns of troops all trying to move through the same constricted spaces. Patton himself walked ahead of his tanks, trying to find routes through the obstacles, exposing himself repeatedly to enemy fire in his determination to keep his units moving forward. The carefully planned offensive began dissolving into confusion as units lost contact with their headquarters, commanders lost track of their units, and the fog of war descended completely over the battlefield. The 77th Division, advancing through the Argonne Forest itself, discovered why the Germans had been content to defend this sector with relatively few troops. The forest was a nightmare of ravines, thick undergrowth, and hidden dangers. Companies became separated from their battalions. Battalions lost contact with their regiments. German defenders, knowing every trail and clearing, struck suddenly from unexpected directions and then melted back into the woods. American soldiers found themselves fighting in small, isolated groups, never certain whether the sounds of battle in the distance meant help or more danger. By nightfall of the first day, the American advance had captured significant ground but at tremendous cost. Medical stations behind the lines overflowed with wounded men, and the narrow roads made evacuating them agonizingly slow. The initial optimism evaporated as officers tallied their casualties and realized how much stronger German resistance had become with each mile gained. Supply columns struggled to keep ammunition and food moving forward through the congested roads, while exhausted soldiers tried to dig defensive positions in the darkness, knowing dawn would bring renewed fighting. 2nd October 1918. Major Charles Whittlesey of the 77th Division found himself in an impossible situation deep in the Argonne Forest. Following orders to advance regardless of casualties or the positions of units on his flanks, he had pushed forward with approximately 550 men from the 1st Battalion, 308th Infantry Regiment. Now, surrounded by German forces on all sides, he discovered that the units supposed to be protecting his flanks had been stopped or driven back. His battalion was isolated, nearly a mile ahead of American lines, with no communication and rapidly dwindling supplies. The soldiers, primarily New York City men unused to wilderness survival, scraped shallow foxholes into the rocky soil of a steep ravine. German forces, recognizing the vulnerable American position, closed in systematically. Machine gun fire swept through the position from multiple directions. German mortars, precisely targeted by observers on the surrounding heights, dropped shells directly into the cramped perimeter. Whittlesey, a former lawyer turned reluctant warrior, maintained iron discipline among his trapped men despite circumstances that would have justified panic. Carrier pigeons represented the battalion's only link to the outside world. Whittlesey sent bird after bird with identical messages requesting relief or permission to withdraw, but most were shot down by German marksmen who recognized their significance. The men grew increasingly desperate as food ran out, water became contaminated with corpses from upstream, and ammunition supplies dwindled. Wounded men suffered without adequate medical supplies, their groans filling the nights with agony that undermined the survivors' morale. On October 3rd, the situation deteriorated catastrophically. American artillery, unaware of the battalion's precise location, began shelling their position as part of a general bombardment intended to suppress German defenses. Whittlesey released his last pigeon, a bird named Cher Ami, carrying a desperate message. "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." The pigeon, wounded by German fire, still managed to reach American lines with the message attached to its leg. German forces, frustrated by the trapped battalion's stubborn resistance, sent an American prisoner forward under a white flag with a surrender demand. The message, written in English, warned that continued resistance was pointless and would result only in more American deaths. Whittlesey read the note, looked at his exhausted, starving men, and reportedly replied with a single word that became legendary in American military history. He refused. The German prisoner returned empty-handed, and the siege continued with renewed ferocity. Relief efforts from American lines made agonizingly slow progress. Every attempt to break through to the surrounded battalion met fierce German resistance. The terrain that had allowed Whittlesey to advance so quickly now worked against the rescuers. Attacks launched to relieve the Lost Battalion, as newspapers had begun calling them, stalled in the same tangled forest that trapped their comrades. Meanwhile, Whittlesey's perimeter shrank daily as German pressure intensified and casualties mounted. 8th October, 1918. While the Lost Battalion endured its 6th day of siege, another drama unfolded 12 miles to the south near the village of Châtel-Chehery. Corporal Alvin Cullum York, a former conscientious objector from the Tennessee mountains, found himself leading a handful of soldiers in one of the war's most remarkable small unit actions. York's squad had been tasked with silencing German machine guns that were decimating their battalion's advance. The patrol worked its way behind German lines, surprised a group of German soldiers eating breakfast, and took them prisoner. But as York's small group herded their prisoners toward American lines, they came under intense fire from German machine gun positions on a nearby hillside. The initial burst killed 6 Americans and wounded 3 others, leaving York as the senior unwounded soldier. Drawing on skills learned hunting turkeys in Tennessee's mountains, York began engaging the German gunners with his rifle, firing with methodical accuracy that seemed impossible under the circumstances. According to his own account, corroborated by surviving witnesses, York shot 17 German soldiers, forcing the remainder to surrender. When German First Lieutenant Paul Vollmer, commanding the position, realized his men were being systematically eliminated by a single American marksman, he attempted to lead a bayonet charge against York. The corporal switched to his pistol and shot all 6 charging Germans in rapid succession, working from back to front so those behind wouldn't realize what was happening and take cover. Vollmer, stunned by the impossibility of what he was witnessing, surrendered his entire company. York marched back to American lines with 132 German prisoners, having silenced 35 machine guns with a squad that had been reduced to 7 effectives. York's actions, though extraordinary, represented countless individual acts of courage occurring daily throughout the Meuse-Argonne sector. Corporal Harold Turner of the 77th Division single-handedly captured 11 German machine gun positions. Sergeant Arthur Forrest led a small group that captured 200 German soldiers defending a crucial strongpoint. These stories of individual heroism emerged from the chaos of battle, offering brief moments of inspiration amid the grinding brutality of the offensive. The human cost, however, continued mounting at rates that shocked even hardened military professionals. Field hospitals established in abandoned French villages and hastily erected tent complexes operated around the clock, overwhelmed by the flood of wounded. Medical officers performed amputations and emergency surgeries under conditions that would have been considered intolerable in peacetime. Nurses worked until they collapsed from exhaustion, then returned to work after brief rest periods. The influenza pandemic, spreading rapidly through the crowded conditions, killed men who had survived German bullets and shells. The 77th Division finally broke through to Whittlesey's trapped battalion on October 7th, after 6 days of isolation. Of the original 550 men, fewer than 200 could walk out under their own power. The survivors, hollow-eyed and filthy, had endured conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Whittlesey himself, though hailed as a hero, was haunted by the losses suffered by men under his command. The Lost Battalion's ordeal became symbolic of the entire Meuse-Argonne Offensive. Extraordinary courage and sacrifice in pursuit of objectives whose strategic value sometimes seemed inadequate compensation for the price paid. 14th October, 1918. General Pershing faced a crisis of confidence as his offensive entered its 3rd week. American casualties had exceeded 100,000 men, and the advance had stalled short of its initial objectives. French Premier Georges Clemenceau, never supportive of American independence on the battlefield, sent a scathing letter to French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, questioning whether American forces were capable of operating independently. The letter demanded that American units be broken up and distributed to French and British command, exactly the scenario Pershing had fought for months to prevent. Pershing's response demonstrated the determination that had brought him to supreme command. He refused to abandon the offensive or surrender American independence, instead reorganizing his forces and renewing the attack with modified tactics. The general ordered his staff to simplify the overcomplicated command structure that had contributed to the initial confusion. Supply lines were rationalized, artillery coordination improved, and infantry tactics adjusted to account for the difficult terrain and formidable German defenses. The American First Army was divided into two separate armies, First and Second, allowing for better command and control across the expanded front. Lieutenant General Hunter Liggett took command of the First Army, bringing organizational skills and tactical sophistication that complemented Pershing's strategic vision. Liggett immediately ordered an operational pause to rest exhausted troops, replenish depleted supplies, and properly coordinate the next phase of operations. This decision, though it meant additional days before resuming the offensive, ultimately proved crucial to eventual success. German defenses, meanwhile, showed signs of strain despite their continued effectiveness. The German army was running out of reserves to feed into the battle. Units that had been holding their positions through sheer professional skill found themselves stretched increasingly thin. The critical railway line at Sedan, the offensive's ultimate objective, carried supplies essential to the entire German Western Front. Every day, American forces drew closer to cutting that lifeline, increased pressure on German commanders to either reinforce this sector or risk catastrophic collapse elsewhere. Historical records maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission document that American forces during this period were also learning harsh lessons about industrial warfare. Early enthusiasm and courage could not substitute for tactical sophistication against an enemy with 4 years of experience. American officers, many of whom had known nothing but garrison duty before 1917, were earning their education in the most expensive school imaginable. Battalion commanders who survived the opening weeks became skilled tacticians. Those who didn't learn quickly became casualties or were relieved of command. The weather turned miserable in mid-October, adding another dimension of suffering to the already nightmarish conditions. Cold rain fell continuously, turning unpaved roads into rivers of mud that swallowed vehicles and made every movement exhausting. Trenches filled with water that mixed with blood to create a horror beyond description. Soldiers developed trench foot, pneumonia, and other ailments that removed them from combat as effectively as German bullets. The influenza pandemic continued its rampage through the close quarters conditions of military camps and frontline positions. 1st November, 1918. The renewed American offensive struck the Kriemhilde Stellung, the strongest section of Germany's defensive system, with carefully coordinated fury. Unlike the chaotic initial assault in September, this attack demonstrated how quickly American forces had absorbed the painful lessons of modern warfare. Artillery barrages were precisely timed and targeted. Infantry advances followed combined arms tactics that integrated machine guns, mortars, and the few remaining operational tanks. Communications had improved dramatically, allowing commanders to respond to developing situations rather than simply following predetermined plans. The 2nd Division, among the most experienced American units after seeing action at Château-Thierry and Belleau Wood earlier in the year, spearheaded the assault on the village of Landres et Saint-Georges, a crucial strongpoint in the German line. The division's Marines and infantry soldiers advanced through withering fire, methodically reducing German positions in brutal close-quarters fighting. House-to-house combat through the shattered village lasted 3 days, with every building becoming a fortress that had to be taken individually. Lieutenant Samuel Parker of the 28th Division kept a diary that survived the war, providing a soldier's eye view of the fighting during this period. His entries, spare and haunted, describe the psychological toll of continuous combat. November 1st, advance 2 miles today, Lost half the company. Can't remember what silence sounds like. November 2nd. More of the same. Jenkins went mad, started laughing and couldn't stop. November 3rd. We took the hill. I wish we hadn't. The things we found there. German resistance remained fierce despite their deteriorating strategic situation. Professional soldiers who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts were not going to surrender easily, even as the broader war situation became increasingly hopeless. German machine gunners remained at their posts, firing until they were overrun or killed. Artillery batteries continued engaging American forces until the infantry was literally upon them. This determined defense, though ultimately futile, ensured that every yard of ground came at tremendous cost. The American 3rd Division crossed the Meuse River on November 3rd in a daring assault that flanked the German defensive positions. Engineers constructed pontoon bridges under fire, a technically demanding operation made nearly impossible by German artillery and machine gun fire converging on the crossing points. Once across, American forces began rolling up German positions from an unexpected direction, forcing withdrawals that accelerated the collapse of the entire defensive line. By November 4th, American forces had broken through the Kriemhilde line at multiple points. The breakthrough, achieved at staggering cost after 6 weeks of continuous combat, opened the road to Sedan and the critical railway line beyond. German commanders, recognizing that the position was no longer tenable, began ordering withdrawals to new defensive lines further north. The American offensive, which had seemed stalled and possibly failed just weeks earlier, suddenly achieved the momentum that Pershing had envisioned in September. The end, though not yet visible, was finally approaching. 6 November 1918. American forces, sensing German resistance crumbling, pursued the withdrawing enemy with an urgency born of 6 weeks of frustration. The methodical, grinding advance through prepared defensive positions transformed into a fluid pursuit across open country. German rearguards fought delaying actions at every favorable terrain feature, trying to buy time for their main forces to establish new positions, but they could no longer stop the American advance. The city of Sedan became the focus of an unexpected rivalry between American units racing to be first to reach the symbolic objective. The French First Army, operating on the American left flank, had historical claim to liberating Sedan, site of France's humiliating defeat by Prussia in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War. French commanders viewed capturing Sedan as a matter of national honor, essential to avenging that earlier catastrophe. American commanders, eager to cap their offensive with a dramatic victory, initially seemed oblivious to French sensitivities regarding the city. The 1st Division, nicknamed the Big Red One, received orders to race for Sedan regardless of boundaries between American and French sectors. This order, issued by Corps headquarters without proper coordination with Pershing's staff, created chaos as American units drove across the fronts of other American divisions and into the French zone of operations. The 42nd Division, whose sector the 1st Division crossed, found its advance disrupted by friendly forces moving perpendicular to their line of advance. General Douglas MacArthur, serving as a brigadier general with the 42nd Division, was nearly shot by American sentries from the 1st Division, who mistook him for a German officer during this confused period. The incident, though resolved without violence, illustrated how the breakdown of unit boundaries created dangerous conditions even in the absence of enemy action. Pershing, learning of the situation, immediately intervened to restore order and ensure that French forces would have the honor of officially liberating Sedan. American forces halted just short of Sedan on November 7th, allowing French troops to enter the city first on November 8th. The gesture, though it disappointed some American officers who had raced their units toward the objective, demonstrated diplomatic sophistication that helped preserve the alliance through the war's final days. Sedan's liberation, accomplished by French soldiers with American forces in close support, symbolized the cooperation that had ultimately defeated Germany, despite numerous tensions and disagreements along the way. The German withdrawal accelerated dramatically during these final days. Units that had fought with desperate determination weeks earlier now showed unmistakable signs of dissolution. Prisoners surrendered willingly, grateful to escape a war they knew was lost. Equipment was abandoned along roads as German forces prioritized speed over salvaging material. American intelligence officers reported encountering entire German positions that had been evacuated without a fight, a situation unthinkable during the offensive's early weeks. The German army was not yet defeated, but it was clearly a force in crisis. 11th November 1918, 0500 hours. Word reached frontline American units that an armistice would take effect at 1100 hours that morning. The reaction among soldiers varied dramatically depending on their circumstances and personalities. Some cheered and celebrated, hardly able to believe they had survived. Others received the news with numb silence, too exhausted or traumatized to process its meaning. A few continued fighting with intensified fury, determined to kill as many Germans as possible before the deadline, while some simply wanted to survive these final hours without becoming the war's last casualties. The morning of November 11th saw some of the offensive's most intense fighting, a paradoxical fury as both sides knew the war was ending. Some American commanders ordered attacks to capture objectives or reach symbolic positions before the armistice took effect, decisions that resulted in soldiers dying hours or even minutes before the official cessation of hostilities. The village of Stenay, targeted because it contained bathing facilities American officers wanted to use, was attacked on the morning of November 11th, resulting in casualties for an objective of no military significance with the war ending in hours. Private Henry Gunther of the 313th Infantry Regiment became the last American soldier killed in World War I. At 10:59, 1 minute before the armistice took effect, Gunther charged a German machine gun position near the French village of Chaumont-devant-Damvillers. German soldiers, aware the war was seconds from ending, tried to wave him off, but Gunther continued forward and was shot dead. Whether his action represented courage, madness, or a desire for redemption, he had been demoted for writing a letter discouraging friends from enlisting, remains debated among historians. At precisely 1100 hours, the guns fell silent across the Western Front. Soldiers on both sides emerged from their trenches, some approaching each other cautiously, others simply standing in stunned silence at the absence of the sound that had dominated their lives for weeks, months, or years. Captain Harry Truman, future American president, was commanding an artillery battery that fired its last shells at exactly 10:45, then ordered his men to clean their guns. The transition from war to peace occurred in an instant, yet the psychological adjustment would take much longer. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive concluded as the largest and bloodiest operation in American military history to that point. Over 1 million American soldiers had participated in the 47-day campaign. American casualties totaled approximately 120,000, including 26,000 dead. The offensive had achieved its strategic objectives. The critical railway line at Sedan was cut, German defensive positions were breached, and American forces had proven capable of conducting major independent operations. The cost, however, shocked a nation unprepared for the industrial-scale slaughter that characterized the Great War. General Pershing, vindicated in his insistence on maintaining American independence, received credit for the offensive's ultimate success while also facing criticism for the high casualties and initial confusion. His determination to prove American military capability, regardless of cost, had succeeded in establishing the United States as a major military power, but the price paid by individual soldiers and their families cast a shadow over the victory. 11th November 1920. Exactly 2 years after the armistice, an unknown American soldier killed in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive was laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery, inaugurating a tradition of honoring unidentified war dead that continues to the present. The soldier's identity remained unknown, but his service and sacrifice represented the 26,000 Americans who died in the offensive and the 116,000 who died in World War I overall. The ceremony at Arlington, attended by President Woodrow Wilson and thousands of veterans and grieving families, marked the beginning of a long process of coming to terms with what the war had cost. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive transformed the American military and, by extension, American society. Before the offensive, the United States maintained a small professional army supplemented by National Guard units, a force adequate for frontier duties and minor interventions, but incapable of influencing major power conflicts. After the offensive, America possessed a battle-tested military organization and a generation of officers and soldiers who had learned modern warfare's harsh lessons. This capability would shape American foreign policy and international relations for decades. Individual veterans struggled with varying degrees of success to reintegrate into civilian life. Major Charles Whittlesey, hero of the Lost Battalion, never recovered from the psychological wounds of commanding men in hopeless circumstances. He committed suicide in 1921 by jumping from a ship while traveling to Cuba. Corporal Alvin York returned to Tennessee and used his fame to establish educational institutions for mountain children, living until 1964 as a celebrated embodiment of American courage and values. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton's experience commanding tanks in the Meuse-Argonne convinced him that armored warfare represented the future. He spent the interwar years developing doctrine and tactics that would prove crucial during World War II, when he commanded armored divisions that applied lessons learned in the Argonne Forest on a vastly larger scale. The Meuse-Argonne was, for Patton and many others, less a conclusion than a proving ground for concepts that would mature in later conflicts. The battlefield itself became a place of pilgrimage and memory. The American Battle Monuments Commission established 8 military cemeteries in the Meuse-Argonne region, containing over 30,000 American graves. The Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery at Romagny-sur-Montfaucon became the largest American military cemetery in Europe. Its white crosses and stars of David, stretching across rolling hills that had seen such terrible fighting. Visitors walking these grounds can still see the terrain that shaped the battle: the dense Argonne forest, the commanding heights of the Meuse, the small villages that became focal points for desperate combat. France erected monuments throughout the battlefield region, commemorating not only French soldiers but also the Americans who died liberating French territory. The Pennsylvania Memorial near Varennes-en-Argonne honors the 28th Division's service. The Montfaucon American Monument rises 180 feet above the battlefield, offering visitors views across terrain where hundreds of thousands of soldiers fought and tens of thousands died. These monuments serve as permanent reminders of the alliance that defeated Imperial Germany and the sacrifice that victory required. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive's strategic significance extended beyond its immediate military results. The operation demonstrated that American industrial capacity could be translated into military power quickly and effectively. Within 18 months of entering the war, the United States fielded, transported, supplied, and commanded in combat an army that played a decisive role in defeating a major power. This capability fundamentally altered global power dynamics and established patterns that would shape the 20th century. Historians continue debating the offensive's conduct and consequences. Some argue that Pershing's tactics were unnecessarily costly, that American forces could have achieved the same objectives with fewer casualties through more sophisticated approach. Others contend that given the terrain, German defensive skill, and American inexperience, the casualties were inevitable, and that Pershing's determination to maintain American independence justified the cost. These debates reflect broader questions about military leadership, the value of strategic autonomy, and the terrible arithmetic of war. The offensive's veterans, as they aged, became increasingly important voices in debates about American foreign policy and military intervention. Some, traumatized by what they had experienced, became committed pacifists, arguing that no objective justified the suffering they had witnessed. Others believed their sacrifice had been necessary and meaningful, that American military power must be maintained to prevent future conflicts or to ensure victory if deterrence failed. These competing perspectives, born from shared experience in the Meuse-Argonne, shaped American attitudes toward World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive remains a defining moment in American military history, a campaign that tested and ultimately validated American claims to great power status. The soldiers who fought through the Argonne Forest, across the heights of the Meuse, and finally to Sedan demonstrated that American courage and determination could match any adversary. They paid for that validation with their lives, their health, and their innocence, leaving a legacy that continues shaping how America understands itself and its role in the world. The offensive was neither the beginning nor the end of American military involvement abroad, but it represented a threshold crossed, a point beyond which the United States could never again claim to be merely a spectator to global conflicts. The cost of crossing that threshold is recorded in the neat rows of white markers at Romagny-sous-Montfaucon, silent testimony to the price of America's emergence onto the world stage.